So now began what you might call Chapter 2 of the search for Osama bin Laden, trying to find out whether it was truly bin Laden who was living in that compound in Abbottabad. The CIA and the American intelligence community tried everything they could do, had all the resources at their disposal that were possible. According to press reports, CIA officers rented a house down the road from the compound. They used all the technology available to surveil that house, but they weren't able to figure out whether Osama bin Laden was actually living there. They even used tools such as a stealthy drone, an unmanned aerial vehicle or UAV, that until that point hadn't been acknowledged. The American people and the world didn't know it even existed. But none of those tools were able to pinpoint whether or not bin Laden was in that house. They even identified some man, some person who they called the pacer, who would go outside the house and walk around in the compound during the day. And they tried everything they could, including enlisting the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, NGA, which is the American intelligence agency that mans and runs our reconnaissance satellites, to try to identify who is that man and how tall is he. Because we knew that bin Laden was about 6 feet 4 inches. But at least according to press reports, the best that the NGA could do by looking using the greatest reconnaissance and surveillance means available, the best they could do was identify the person who was the pacer as being somewhere between 5'8" and 6'8" inches tall, which wasn't enough. There were some fascinating ideas that were tried and some that weren't tried to try to identify whether bin Laden was in that house. One of my favorites is the idea that because we already knew what the DNA makeup was of the bin Laden family, if somehow we could have gotten a sample of the local sewage coming out of that house, we might have been able to identify whether the people in that house belonged to the bin Laden family. We don't think that that idea was actually tried, but I kind of wonder who would have gotten the job of somehow trying to analyze and get a sample of the poop coming out of that house and check it out. But one other brilliant, imaginative idea that was tried, and that has become very well known, was that the intelligence community enlisted the services of a Pakistani doctor to carry out a hepatitis B vaccination campaign. They evidently were actually conducting real vaccinations, but the real goal was to get access to that compound, to that house, get a blood sample, and again try to identify whether people in that house were part of the bin Laden family. That didn't work. They weren't able to get that sample. And as we have learned in the news, that doctor has been sentenced to a long time in prison in a Pakistani jail. And then in the fall of 2010, the planning began for what eventually was to become the raid on Abbottabad. But here the intelligence community faced a paradox. They still didn't know for sure whether bin Laden was actually in that house. And they found that the more people they brought into the problem, the more agencies they asked, the more red teams they established to try to figure out whether or not bin Laden might be there, the more possibility there was that somehow the word would leak. But luckily, happily, the word did not leak out, and eventually the mission to actually carry out the raid was given to the U.S. Special Operations Forces, but it was still under the overall command of the CIA, under Article 50 of the U.S. Code, a CIA operation. There still were last-minute doubts, and in fact, the whole show was almost given away when WikiLeaks published some documents, and the New York Times published a report on the WikiLeaks documents. In those documents were some reports on interrogations and other activity going on at Guantanamo Bay. And one of the detainees at Guantanamo Bay had told his interrogator that, well, the town of Abbottabad was very important in some way to Al-Qaeda. If Al-Qaeda had been reading the New York Times, if bin Laden had been paying attention to the news and had realized that we knew something was important about Abbottabad, the whole show might have been lost. Then, of course, the raid was a great success for the American Special Forces community, for the American SEALs who carried it out. But what interests me most is what lessons that raid and the 10-year search that led up to it provide us for the American intelligence community today and tomorrow. One of the most important lessons is the value of the close working relationship that was established during that decade between the intelligence community and the U.S. military. Now, I think most Americans would probably assume that two organizations, two parts of the American national security community, must clearly work together regularly anyway. But that isn't necessarily the case. In fact, Admiral McRaven, the military head of the operation at Abbottabad, said afterward that the bin Laden operation wouldn't have been a success if the CIA and the JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command that carried out the operation, hadn't been in bed together for 10 years. They'd been working very closely together. Another lesson is that it's interesting, but evidently the newer organizations that have been established in the American intelligence community since 9/11, such as the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and the National Counterterrorism Center, those new organizations were not as central to the search for bin Laden as the older legacy organizations of the American intelligence community, such as the Central Intelligence Agency and its own counterterrorism center, the CTC. I think that some of the most important and fascinating lessons about American intelligence from the search for bin Laden deal with both the capabilities and also the limitations that we saw of American intelligence. And I think that's important because we often get a misleading view, a misleading take on intelligence capabilities from watching television and movies. We assume, many Americans, many of our allies around the world, assume that American intelligence can do anything. And so when something goes wrong, we often assume that somebody must have made either a single mistake or maybe there's some fatal flaw in the system. But the search for bin Laden shows that the American intelligence community, although it has many capabilities, also is not all capable. It took 10 years to find bin Laden, and even then we didn't know for sure whether he was there until the SEALs went into that house. It's interesting that much of the success of the search for bin Laden wasn't so much the success of secret agents with guns, traveling around the world doing exciting things like in James Bond movies. Instead, as counterterrorism expert Bruce Riedel has said, the search for bin Laden was more the work of the Hercule Poirot idea, of the mind, the little gray cells of the fictional detective Poirot. It was more the work of Poirot than James Bond. It was the long-term, painstaking, decade-long collection of information and all-source analysts that really provided the information needed to point out the importance of the compound at Abbottabad. It's what we call intelligence fusion. It was putting together all sources of intelligence, the collection of it and the analysis of it. I think what we're seeing today and what the Abbottabad raid and the search for bin Laden demonstrate is that American intelligence is changing today. Typically, the American way of intelligence, built during the Cold War, has been one that has relied largely on big, expensive equipment and technology, that traditional American way of intelligence that relies on people, money, and technology. That got us through the Cold War, and it was great when we were able to focus on a particular enemy, a particular adversary such as the Soviet Union. But the search for bin Laden shows that those traditional tools of American intelligence aren't enough. They're not the things that helped us find bin Laden. Instead, what we've been seeing for the past several decades, even before 9/11, is that the American intelligence community has been going through a series of what in the military and in the Navy we often call sea changes. Times when everything is different, when you can't rely on the old traditional tools and techniques. The first sea change that really shook the American intelligence community came at the end of the Cold War, when instead of facing one major enemy, we were now facing in the 1990s what a former director of the CIA once called a jungle of snakes. It took about a decade through the 1990s as we tried to figure out how to do intelligence, what is American intelligence for? And then 9/11 came. And that provided us once more with one single major enemy, one adversary.
And the people who knocked these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
But even then, it took us another decade to adapt to that latest sea change, to figure out what the tools are, what the techniques are that could help us deal with these new, more difficult challenges, such as finding the world's most recognizable bad guy. What I'm worried about today is that we are now facing another sea change, that we are now facing what you might call a new American way of intelligence, where the threats are even more varied. We're not facing just one single threat. It's certainly not the Soviet Union. It's certainly not Al-Qaeda and conventional international terrorism today. The Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, has said that this era is the most challenging one for American intelligence of any that he has been through in his 50-year career in the intelligence community. I think what he means is that American intelligence is facing a more varied array of challenges. Today, the concern is, what should we do about Syria? What should we do about homegrown terrorism? What should we do about state actors such as Iran and North Korea, and non-state actors of all sorts? What worries me is that over the past several decades, it's usually taken the American intelligence community and the American national security community about a decade to get a handle on each of the new types of threats. Each time we face a sea change, it takes us about a decade before we can really get our act together and find Osama bin Laden, for instance. What worries me today is that even though we have found a new way of working with intelligence that was successful in ultimately finding Osama bin Laden and killing him, I'm not sure that even these new tools and techniques, all-source analysis, fusion, close working between the U.S. military and the U.S. intelligence community, I'm not sure that those are going to be enough to deal with the new challenges that are facing the American intelligence community. I think the first step, the first thing we need to do, is have an even more open and informed discussion about intelligence among the American people and with our leaders. We've started on that discussion, but I think a better understanding of intelligence through understanding the things that worked and the things that didn't work in the search for Osama bin Laden can help us on this way to a national discussion about intelligence and national security and how to go forward from here.